To complete our overview of what it takes to shoot a movie, this week we're going to cover special effects. It all goes back to Georges Méliès, the French filmmaker at the turn of the last century, whose theatrical magic was done mainly with special effects that were matting or compositing one image over another from his stage effects and shooting them on film. He was made recently more famous by Martin Scorsese's movie Hugo, which had Sir Ben Kingsley play the role of Méliès, and the effects that Méliès made back at the turn of the century re-rendered in our modern technology to look just as magical. With the silent movies moving into the talkies, all the Frankenstein movies really advanced special effects. The Bride of Frankenstein having this galvanizing electrical effect, and of course we moved on into science fiction, where the early days of science fiction movies had special effects that weren't that shabby. They were sometimes ridiculous, but still, people went to see them and were convinced. The matting process of superimposing uh, large bugs and small towns and miniatures as models to use to blow up for film was common practice and worked, and it does. And to this day, we still have our special effects, which are just as ridiculous if we look at some of our recent movies where we have digitized zombies crawling over walls. And our special effects we've covered for our makeup overview are still used and prominent, and for a low budget movie, still very practical, and for our high budget horror movies, more and more sophisticated with digital technology. This is from The Descent. Pretty gruesome, but very effective special effect. In special effects in the movies, it's under the domain of the art department. SFX or special effects artists come in and do anything that has to do with pyro or explosives. If you see in this scene here, this is set up in the movie. You have to have a federal license to handle any explosives like this, but it is the domain of the special effects department, who confer with the production designer and the art director on what should be done. So anything that has any kind of explosive nature is a special effect, as we can see here. If we're doing any kind of smoke or steam or anything like that, that's also a special effect. So special effects department would come here in the 007 movie and make it seem as if the car was on fire. On a lower budget movie, they come in here like this gentleman here who's letting the air out of the tires just before the shot to make it seem like the car is still wrecked and unable to move, and steaming the front of the car with a fog machine or something like that. In Singing in the Rain here, any kind of rain effect, any water effect like that, it's a special effect. It's here we had rain, of course, which the water was mixed with milk to create the effect. Here is a special effect of, you can see in action where they just got enough water to make the effect work in this couple in the movie. Here's somebody who's rigging up, covering for the fluorescent lights so that the water doesn't get and cause any kind of electrical mishap. You can rig your own special effects sprinklers by putting a sprinkler up on a couple of stands like this, or if you're doing a 007 movie like this with Judi Dench, you bring in your fancy equipment where we have big sprinklers on Condor cranes that provide the rain effects that we need, and we hang them over streets or whatever to create that rain effect, and that's all special effects. Fog is also a special effect, and ever since we've been shooting movies, they've been a great special effect, and you usually use a fog machine. Here's one that's somewhat rigged up with someone's own equipment, but it still works. We can see the fog shooting out of the nozzle here. Most of the times you can buy a fog machine here. They have different models, but this is a basic model that we have over at C&M. And you fill it with fog juice. It's this mixture, it's a liquid mixture, and then it heats up, and then you run it with a remote so that you can spray on set. Here's somebody who's taken that fog machine, put a little ducting on to get a little further, and then put a little self-made cardboard box to amplify this fog. There's all sorts of ways of doing it. But whatever you do, you get the effect that we see in so many horror movies. This is an example of a fog machine that's revved up to go with the fan, both special effects to spread it so that maybe you get something like this effect here in a John Carpenter movie. If you go for the big effects here with big fans, that's still part of the special effects department. Here on the day the Earth stood still, we had a lot of fans going, big fans blowing a lot of smoke. It's all special effects in that place. When you're trying to texture light with any kind of substance, whether it's fog or maybe floating pieces of paper, confetti, it's again special effects, texturing the light with things that move. Here's a production of Faust, a silent movie way back when, but you can see the special effects here where they created a small town with the miniature, and then they're blowing their fog, they're getting ready, and it develops over time where miniatures are used more and more. In the early 30s here we can see this gentleman here has created a miniature set, and then they come in with a close-up and it looks large. And towards the end of the 20s, with the silent movie Metropolis, Fritz Lang's masterpiece, they actually had magazine articles talking about all the special effects that were taking place in Metropolis. Just like nowadays we talk about special effects in green screen, and we have all sorts of blogs and articles about it. Same thing back here in 1927. They're talking about how this city that was rendered Metropolis was made by miniatures and wires, and so they show the movie, and then in the background they show how it was made to look more science fiction-like. And here, even in the movie, they had an example at one point, this is 1927, of what they were foretelling as a future television-like object. This is like a television screen before television happened. People didn't know what it was, but they created it for the sci-fi movie. And this great scene where this electrocution takes place, where the robot gets going. We see we see it in the movie. It's a wonderful image in the movie, and then in this periodical, they talk about what they did to create this effect with electricity. And then when they composited the city, they went in the article and they showed how they rendered it with drawings and then built the miniature to make it all happen. So miniatures have been big in special effects ever since. And here's a gentleman recently working on a miniature for a film. In the 50s here, The Forbidden Planet, a sci-fi movie that was a big hit. We can see the use of photographing the actress separately so we could create a miniature, and using lighting the special effects back then. This is 1956. It was all big and new, and compositing like the robot as a model juxtaposed against the characters so that it seems larger and more imposing. A master at special effects back in the 40s and 50s is a man named Ray Harryhausen, and he did all sorts of big hits in the 50s. This is Jason and the Argonauts, where he would superimpose his actors, or he would have the actors superimposed on his models. Now, of course, The Matrix is our standard of special effects, and it just shows the advances we've made. And with The Matrix, we use a system, what we call a motion capture system. And you see these little cameras that are surrounding this gentleman here. These are small cameras that shoot simultaneously, so that when the actor moves and has dots or little foam tablets on his outfit or his face, this goes into an algorithm in a computer that creates a CGI, a computer-generated image that is part of what becomes the special effect. And so with The Matrix, we had all these cameras surrounding it so we could get some 3D space. And we have this, what they call it, bullet cameras. So every time the person moved, they could record the image, and then when they played it back in slow motion, we get that wonderful Matrix effects against the green screen here. So all these, 360 degrees of what we call mocap or motion cap cameras going into a computer program to give us the movie with a little wire work, and then getting the special effects. This against the green screen creates all that flying we see in The Matrix. And finally, if you are in a cheap special effects arena, you can actually paint your special effects. And somehow you could either use it against a plate of glass like they did in the old days, or take some plastic and scratch your special effects and use lighting to create the poor person's special effects, but it still works to this day. It doesn't matter if you have $50 million or $100. You can create the special effects. You can blow them up larger with the lenses you use on your camera and still create that background that's just as interesting as it was when Georges Méliès created it in about 1903.